Hi, beautiful people. I'm Jen Madrone, and today I'm here because I want to talk to you guys about a topic that comes up a lot in our group, and I see it in comments on my ad and in other discussions, and that is what is the definition of egoic death? There's a lot of debate around this because a lot of people say, the ego can't die, you shouldn't kill the ego, and so many different things. And it's true. What we're doing is not killing the ego, but what we are doing is putting it in its rightful place and not letting it control the show anymore. But egoic death is a term that's been around for quite a while. It's one that's been used a lot with mystics and spiritual teachers, but it's only until recently that it's become more known and more commonly heard. And that's because more and more people are awakening on the planet and having egoic death and spiritual awakening experiences. And so as it becomes heard more and more, we start to kind of pick apart what does this really mean? What is this term about? And this term has historically been used to define a process within the process of spiritual awakening, a process of dissolving of the self, dissolving of our identity, dissolving of our attachment to our identity and to who we think we are. And this process can be one of the more difficult aspects of awakening and can cause a lot of trauma and a lot of issues. And so that's why I chose to make this Facebook group around it, because for me, it was one of the most difficult parts of the process. And I see a lot of people struggling with it. And so this debate about the term egoic death is, it's interesting. I understand why it occurs because I hear contradictions in speech all the time, even among spiritual teachers and mystics. And even recently, I was listening to a amazing Sufi mystic, talking about egoic death and the awakening process. And he said that among the Sufis, they often say that we must crucify the ego, and that those are the words that he uses, crucify the ego. But a couple sentences later, he says, but the ego cannot die. There's just a point in the path where the ego bows its head and it submits and it relinquishes its spot as king and is now becoming our servant. And so this really helped me understand why it can be difficult for people to understand the egoic death process, or what the egoic death term means, because, we have this contradiction where we are often saying we must kill the ego. And then two sentences later, we say, but the ego can't die. It's simply because it's an accepted term, but also there's a death that happens that doesn't actually mean complete obliteration. What's dying is not actually the ego itself. What's dying in this process is our identity with our ego, our identity, who we thought we are, and an attachment to that identity. So at some point in the process, it can happen either subtly or very extremely and spontaneously, that we have an experience or we begin to realize that who we thought we were, this identity that we've built around ourselves as mother, teacher, father, student, whatever that is, we begin to realize that that's not actually who we are. That everything that we thought was true, everything that we have built our foundation around, isn't actually true. But then we stand in a point where we're not really sure what is true. And it feels almost like someone has pulled the rug out from underneath our feet and we have nothing to stand on anymore. And this can feel like something is dying, because it is, because our identity is dying, our attachment to our ego is dying, our attachment to our old beliefs is dying. So it very much feels like a death. So that's why I like the egoic death term. I think that it does very much refer to what the process feels like. And for some people who are not ready for this experience or have no idea of what's happening, it can be really painful. And if they don't have anyone around them who knows what's happening, sometimes they can end up on meds, diagnosed with a mental illness, because people aren't understanding what's happening, because there is a split that's happening. There is a breakdown that's happening, but it's not an illness. It's not an illness at all. It's a transformational process that's happening. And so even if we are expecting it, we know what's happening, it still can be very difficult and very, very traumatic. And there's a lot of symptoms that we've talked about in this group and in other videos that go with the egoic death process. And as we move through it, sometimes it takes quite a long time. And also, I want to mention that it's not a one and done thing. It's not like we have the big egoic death and then all of a sudden we're transformed, our ego is no longer in charge, and we're enlightened. That's not how it works. There's often many, many egoic death experiences, some larger than others, throughout the process, which is actually really great, because if it all happened at once, we would actually lose our minds, most likely. I think on occasion that it has happened with Ascended Masters, but it's definitely not a usual experience. And so really, if we can hold this idea of egoic death loosely and not nitpick at what other people's opinions of it are or definitions of it are, but hold it as the transformational process that it is, as the dying of what doesn't serve us anymore, the dying away of this false identity, so that what is truly us can be revealed. And so we can use so many different words and so much language to describe it. But it really is a transformational process, which is why it can be really difficult to define it. And I think